So I want to bring in Licinio Miranda, University of Florida doctoral student.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
So the fisherman, I have that right, was Francisco Jose do Nascimento.
Perfect. Your Portuguese is perfect.
I get that a lot. And from my understanding is that although his trade was as a fisherman, one of the things the fisherman did to make money as well was move cargo or slaves, in this case, back and forth from seagoing vessels to the shore. Is that roughly right?
Perfect. Actually, back then in Brazil, since the ports were in terrible condition, so you would have usually port workers who are also fishermen, who work part-time at the docks, and they would be hard to carry, as you mentioned, to carry cargo, and that would be merchandise, goods in general, and also slaves as well. Perfect.
And you are studying, if I have this correct, you are studying the abolitionist movement in Brazil back in, I guess, the 19th century, right? The late 19th century?
Yes, I'm doing research on that. I think it's a very important topic. It is just as important in Brazil as it is in the United States. I think it's not only important, but it's actually a very contemporary topic, very important to this very day.
So tell us a little bit about Francisco, because I know how the story ends, but I'm curious why it is you got so fixated on finding him, and what happened when you decided to set out on that search.
You gave her a great context already, but I can add a few more things. So what happened was that Francisco do Nascimento, he was a poor man, and he was a man of color. So you have this person of color who came from an impoverished background. He was a legitimate child, so he didn't know his father. And somehow he was able, by leading a bunch of people just like him, some of whom were former slaves, others were actually slaves themselves, and they joined forces for a greater cause. So this is a man who, in theory, he should not have had any kind of impact in Brazilian history, and somehow he was able to rise to the occasion, and take the leadership, of a movement such as the abolitionist movement.
And so you decided you were going to find him.
Yes, I was upset that although he's regarded as a national hero in Brazil, no one knew where he had been buried. No one. So I found out that a man of his importance to our history had been just forgotten like that. So I started doing research, trying to understand more, not only about where he was buried, but more about him as well. About his participation in the anti-slavery movement.
Right. So you're from Brazil originally. Do I have that right?
Yes, I am. I'm Brazilian.
And
yes.
You went back home and you went searching in really old graveyards, essentially, right?
Yeah. So what happened was that I started doing research, locating documents, trying to read, old newspapers, trying to understand what happened in his last days. So I was able to track down the exact location of the cemetery in which he was buried, which is the St. John the Baptist Cemetery in Fortaleza, which is in the northeast of Brazil. Fortaleza means fortress in English. So it's one of the largest cities in Brazil. It's a beautiful place, has wonderful beaches. So if you can travel there, you'll love it. But I knew the city, I knew the cemetery, I was able to locate. So I had to find his grave. So what happened was that I went there, for over 3 years. I would travel during summer, I would go there and I would try to locate among 15,000 tombs in that cemetery, which is huge. I'm not talking just, some gravestones. I'm talking about the kind of necropolis, place, huge, with those monuments, with statues. So it took a while until I was finally able. I'm sorry.
Going back to the 1800s, not just a big one, but
very perfect. Very old. Very old. The ground was was uneven. It was hot because Brazil. So it took some time, and it happened.
When you say it happened, you mean you found it?
Yes, I did. So eventually, one day, in late July, of last year, I was walking around as usual, looking one by one, of the tombs until I saw it. I saw this very old tomb in ruins, but the plaque with his name, with his birth date and death date were still there. And so I just knew it. I had found it.
Yeah. So it's sort of obvious, I think, on the face of it, why this would be important to Brazil today. But I was really glad to hear you say earlier that you think it matters now, because in reading up on his story a little bit, I was also fascinated by the idea that a man of color who was worked in a poor man's trade. And was 42 years old. This wasn't even some young firebrand. How is it? Why does his story and what he achieved in Brazil then? Why does that resonate with you today? And why does that feel like something that you think we should consider important?
Because, as you mentioned, he's a man of color from poor background who was fighting for a great cause. He was fighting not only, this is important to mention, not only against slavery, not only for freedom, of his fellow Brazilians, back home, but he was also fighting for equality, for racial equality. He was fighting for tolerance, for people to be able, to be treated as and seen as equals. And so those are the kind of values that you can say that are universal. They're not just important for Brazilians. They were not just important for Brazilians back then. They're important for Brazilians now, and they're important just as much for Americans. So I believe that Americans, they can learn much from Brazil, just as Brazil can learn much about United States history, because you can go back, take a look beyond the borders, and see those men and women who did so much, even though they had so little themselves.
So how, I was not familiar with the history here, but based on what I've read, the abolitionist movement, in very clear contrast, right, to the United States, succeeded peacefully. There was no civil war over the issue of slavery. And I'm curious if you can sort of give us a quick idea of what were the political dynamics that Brazil was able to dismantle this. I forget, there's a cliche about it, this strange institution. What is it they used to call it?
I would just say cruel institution is more than enough.
Of course, yes, absolutely, of course, yeah. How is it that this entire country was able to dismantle this piece of its economy, this piece of how it worked peacefully? Because we still haven't figured it out.
Yeah, so what happened was that, unlike the US, this is the very reason to why Brazil took so long, to end slavery. What happened was that activists throughout the country, they were able to join forces, not only with middle class, upper class, but I'm talking about the common people of color, former slaves themselves, whom they helped escape from plantations, whom they helped, hide from their slave owners. And so by doing that, by being active, not in towns, in the countryside, doing protesting, calling against slavery in newspapers, they were able to accomplish much, as you mentioned, without the need for a civil war.
Man, it's just such a fantastic story, and I love the fact that your story shines a light on that bigger, broader story that still has so much resonance today for us, a continent away. So Licinio Miranda, thanks so much for joining us here on The Conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.